It was a dry season morning in 2025, and the ground across Burkina Faso was cracked open like old pottery, abandoned in the sun. For years, the people of the Sahel had learned to read the sky with dread warplanes, drones, clouds that never rained. But on this day, they looked up and saw something unimaginable. Helicopters roared overhead. Engines thundered like war. Yet instead of bombs, the skies opened and rained corn. Not a token gesture. Not a few symbolic Saxbo 2000. Metric tons of maize pouring from the bays of military aircraft. And it wasn't a foreign aid drop. No logos. No NGO slogans. This was an order from President Ibrahim Traoré himself, a soldier turned leader, a man known more for defiance than reform. In a single stroke, he had turned machines of war into instruments of hope. Children ran barefoot, laughing as kernels bounced in the dust. Elders wept, women prayed, and entire villages stood frozen in awe as the sky gave them not weapons, but seeds. For the first time in decades, the future arrived, not wrapped in someone else's flag, but in something they could plant, nurture, and call their own. But with every miracle comes resistance. As seeds took root in the soil, resistance took root abroad from old powers, from lobbies, from those who profited off Africa's hunger. Was this a miracle in the making, or a desperate gamble disguised as poetry? The story didn't begin in the fields. It began inside a war room in Ouagadougou. Traoré stood before his generals, bareheaded, and issued an order that sounded absurd. Fill the helicopters. Not with bullets, not with soldiers. Fill them with corn. Within hours, fleets of military and civilian aircraft were repurposed. No IMF paperwork. No foreign consultants. Just action. Planes flew low over cracked, abandoned farmland, scattering golden seed across desolate soil. Pilots who once trained for battle now carried life. Villages erupted in song. Farmers bowed their heads in reverence. For generations, salvation had arrived in the form of foreign aid trucks. This time, it came from within. And then came the second miracle. Weeks after the last drop, the skies opened. Soft, steady showers kissed the ground. Green shoots rose where satellites had long marked desert. Germination rates stunned scientists 40% higher than projected in unsalvageable regions. Families roasted corn over open fires. Clinics reported fewer cases of malnutrition. The people called it rain made of seeds. Yet the miracle was never just about food. It was about dignity. Helicopters once feared as predators were now painted by children as saviors. Machines of war had become icons of life. But as hope spread, so did whispers of doubt. Could one bold gamble really rewrite history? It didn't take long for those whispers to turn into headlines abroad. European trade desks issued technical warnings about Burkina Faso's maize certified, non-compliant, unsafe for markets. But beneath the jargon lay fear. For decades, Africa had been framed as dependent, forever in need of imports. Suddenly, one of its poorest nations was feeding itself and exporting. European lobbies panicked. A leaked email from a grain CEO put it bluntly. We cannot let this become a precedent. But Traoré was unshaken. In a fiery speech before tens of thousands, he thundered. They called it madness when we reclaimed our gold mines. They called it danger when we sowed our own soil. Now they call it a threat because we feed our children without their stamp of approval. His defiance drew applause in villages and alarm in boardrooms. Within weeks, Burkina Faso signed its first contracts with the Middle East. Soon, India and China followed, not just for maize, but for ethanol and flour. What Europe tried to block, others rushed to embrace. And here lies the question that rattled the global order. When a hungry nation feeds itself without permission, is it progress or is it a threat to those who profit from hunger? Inside Burkina Faso, the answer was clear. Farmers organized cooperatives. Women launched processing plants. Youth guarded new fields and built small businesses from cornmeal to corn oil. International media, once obsessed with famine and terrorism, now showed children laughing over roasted corn and women bottling Sahel's suncorn oil for export. The revolution was no longer a government decree, it was identity. Yet Brussels and Geneva weren't done. Restrictions mounted, sanitary barriers, customs rules, endless protocols. To ordinary Burkinab, it was hypocrisy. When they sell to us, it's free trade. When we sell to them, it's a threat. But instead of retreating, Traoré doubled down. Export revenues funded irrigation, seed research, and local industry. Parliament declared, we don't measure sovereignty in speeches anymore. We measure it in harvests. Subscribe and like, line mid-video. If you believe stories like this matter, stories of dignity without permission, don't just watch. Subscribe, like, and share, so more people see what the headlines won't tell. From the countryside, women became unlikely revolutionaries. Selling roasted corn, pooling profits, and buying oil presses, they transformed villages. By 2028, over 70% of corn cooperatives were led by women. With profits, they built schools, funded clinics, and lit homes with solar power. Literacy soared. Maternal deaths dropped. Girls stayed in school. Youth too found a reason to stay. Thousands who once dreamed of crossing the Mediterranean now built futures at home. I used to dream of Europe, one young entrepreneur said, Now I dream of building a factory here. The true revolution wasn't in policy, it was in psychology. For the first time in generations, the message was not leave to survive, but stay to build. But abroad, storms brewed. American think tanks debated the Burkina model. Aid lobbies fretted. Would Africa bypass traditional donors and turn to China or the Gulf? Would helicopter farming destabilize markets? Yet for ordinary Americans, especially in the Midwest, the story struck a different chord. Talk Radio asked, if helicopters can drop seeds instead of bombs, what's stopping us? Farmers saw in Burkina Faso not just an African experiment, but a reminder of their own lost dignity through soil and community. Suddenly, a question echoed far beyond Africa. Is food aid about feeding the hungry or about keeping them dependent? By the decade's end, Burkina Faso had not just harvested corn, it had harvested sovereignty, yet the future loomed uncertain. Climate models warned of harsher droughts. European lobbies maneuvered to block exports. And the burden of expectation grew heavier. If the rains failed, would hope wither? Could a nation built on corn withstand the weight of global politics and climate collapse? Or had Burkina Faso planted something deeper than grain, something no drought could kill? Cliffhanger. These are not just African questions. They are global questions. What if sovereignty is not delivered from above, but grown from the ground up? What if dignity can sprout beneath helicopter blades, not armed with bombs, but with hope? If you believe the world deserves stories like this, stories of quiet revolutions, the news won't tell. Share this video. Because what began as 2,000 tons of corn falling from the sky may just be the seed of a new kind of power. One, rooted not in politics, but in people, and in the soil beneath their feet.